Chapter 1. The rusted edge Kaelen Thorne knew the exact weight of a lie because he held it in his hand every single day. The blade was a jagged piece of iron, pitted with rust and smelling of old blood. He didn't need eyes to see the ruin of it. He felt the rough patches with his thumb, a rhythmic, soul-crushing motion that filled the hollow silence of his mountain cabin. Truth be told, he was as broken as the sword. He sat by the hearth, the only heat in a world that had gone cold the day the Alpha King took his sight. He was a man waiting for the fire to go out. The hearth crackled, and he counted the pops like ticking seconds on a death clock. He wanted to maintain a world where nothing moved and nothing hurt. After that, he ran his fingers over the pommel. It was cold. It reminded him of the palace floors where he had knelt while his king, his brother in arms, shoved a hot brand into his sockets. He didn't scream then. He wouldn't scream now. He was a weapon that had been snapped in half and tossed into the weeds. Because of that, he lived in the stagnant air of a ghost. The silence was heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressing against his chest. He felt numb. He wanted to be numb. If he felt nothing, then the ghosts of his dead battalion couldn't find him in the dark. What followed was a long, agonizing stretch of stillness. His ears were his only windows now. He heard the wind howling through the jagged rocks outside, sounding like the screams of the men he had failed. He was a man who measured time by the cooling of the stones. Yet something was different today. The air in the cabin felt tight. He stopped rubbing the blade. He tilted his head, listening to the mountain. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creak of the timber. Deep down, she knew the truth, but he didn't know her yet. He only knew the mountain had been breached. His traps were silent, but his instincts, the primal wolf buried under layers of shame, began to stir. He was a predator who had forgotten how to hunt, but the mountain was telling him he was being watched. Next, he gripped the hilt of the rusted sword. His knuckles turned white. He didn't move from his chair. He let the intruder come. He was a man who wanted to be the prey, hoping that whatever was coming would finally finish what the king had started. Chapter 2. The Vibrations of Fate. The mountain didn't just have ears. It had a heartbeat, and Kaelen felt it through the soles of his boots. He stayed frozen in his chair, but his mind was already outside. He felt the subtle shift in the cabin's pressure. Without warning, a vibration traveled through the floorboards. It was light. It was too light for a soldier in a heavy plate. It was too precise for a mountain beast. In fact, it was the gait of someone who lived in the shadows. He could feel the intruder moving past the tripwire he'd set near the pine grove. They didn't trip it. They knew where it was. This wasn't a random scout. Moments later, he heard the soft crunch of snow. It was a rhythmic sound, steady and careful. He felt his own heart begin to race, a traitorous thumping in his ribs. He hated the feeling. He hated the way his body prepared for a fight he didn't want to win. Still, he didn't reach for his blindfold. He let the darkness be his armor. He tracked the footsteps as they neared the heavy oak door. The intruder paused. He could hear a shallow, quick breath. It was a woman's breath. As the silence stretched, he realized she was waiting for him to speak. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He was a shadow among shadows. He felt the door creak on its rusted hinges, letting in a draft of ice-cold mountain air. What followed was the scent. It hit him like a physical blow. She didn't smell of the king's lavender or the scent of iron. She smelled of rain, old parchment, and a desperate, sharp hunger. It was the smell of the dredge, the slums he had once vowed to protect. As if pulled by a string, he rose from the chair. He didn't make a sound. He moved on instinct, his feet finding the familiar path across the uneven floor. He was a wolf in a cage, and someone had just rattled the bars. But then he felt her presence in the room. She was close. Too close. He could feel the heat radiating from her body. He felt the air move as she shifted her weight. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hide the frantic beat of her pulse. It hummed through the air, a frantic drumming that made his skin itch. He was a man who had surrendered his eyes, but his soul could still feel the light. Soon after, he lunged. He didn't need to see. He followed the sound of her breath and the heat of her skin. He was a blur of gray hair and scarred muscle. Chapter 3. The Deal in the Dark. Before she could scream, he had her. He slammed her against the rough timber of the wall, his arm pressed against her throat. The rusted blade was a cold line against her jugular. At that moment, he expected her to beg. He expected her to cry or claw at his face. Instead, she went perfectly still. Her breath hitched, but she didn't tremble. With every heartbeat, he felt the defiance in her. "You're Kaelen Thorne," she whispered. Her voice was like velvet over gravel. It was a beautiful, dangerous sound. She didn't know what scared her more, his blade or the emptiness in his ruined sockets. He leaned in, his nose inches from hers. "Thorne is dead," he growled. The sound was a low, rumbling snarl that vibrated in his chest. "I'm just the rot he left behind." Despite that, she didn't flinch. "I didn't come for a ghost," she said. "I came for the Iron Gale. I came for the man who can stop a king." As if fate demanded it, he let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It sounded like dry leaves skittering over a grave. He pressed the blade a fraction harder. "Look at me, girl. I can't stop a breeze, let alone a tyrant. I'm blind. I'm broken." On the other hand, she reached up, her fingers ghosting over the hand he had on the sword. Her touch was electric. It burned through his calluses. "You have muscles, General. I have eyes. I will be your sight if you will be my blade." Which meant she was crazy. She was offering him a pact of blood and bone. He felt the subtext in her words. She wasn't just asking for a soldier. She was asking for a miracle. Rather, he wanted to snap her neck and go back to his chair. But then, he heard something else. It was faint, coming from the valley below. The long, low blast of a brass horn. The king's scouts. To make things worse, the horn sounded a second time. Closer now. They were hunting her. Or perhaps they were finally coming for him. In the span of a breath, the world shifted. He realized the silence he had cherished was gone. The king's shadows were at his door, and this woman was the only thing standing between him and a cage. Truth be told, he was tired of being a weapon that did nothing. He felt a spark, a tiny flickering flame of the iron Gale, ignite in his gut. He didn't know if it was hope or just a different kind of hate. So, he lowered the blade. He didn't let her go, but he eased the pressure on her throat. "What's your name, scavenger?" When her name left his lips, she finally exhaled. "Elara. And we need to move, Kaelen. The sun guard doesn't like to wait." And just like that, everything changed. He felt the bond pulse, not the bond of a wolf and his mate, but the bond of two dying stars crashing into each other. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a weapon again, and she had just put her hand on the hilt. That night, the mountain was no longer a grave. It was a fortress. And as the wind shifted, Kaelen Thorne felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He felt the need to kill. Chapter 4. The Echo of Steel. The heavy oak door didn't just open. It exploded inward under the weight of a sun guard's kick. Kaelen didn't need to see the splinters to know the air was now filled with the stench of oiled plate and royal arrogance. Without thinking, he shoved Elara behind him. He stood in the center of the room, a massive, scarred silhouette framed by the dying embers of the hearth. He felt the cold rush of the storm as three men stepped into his sanctuary. In fact, the room felt smaller now, crowded by the heartbeat of killers. He could hear the distinct metallic clink of swords being drawn. His ears mapped their positions, one by the shattered door, two spreading out to flank him. Moments later, the lead scout laughed. It was a sharp, jagged sound that grated against Kaelen's nerves. "The Great Iron Gale," the man sneered, his voice dripping with indulgent condescension, like a man humoring a wounded dog. "Look at you, living in a shed like a mangy cur." Because of that, Kaelen's grip on the rusted iron tightened until the metal bit into his palm. He was blind, and the sudden noise of the wind and the clatter of boots threatened to drown out his seismic senses. He felt a wave of the old shame wash over him, a cold sweat that threatened to lock his joints. But then he felt a small, firm hand press against the small of his back. Elara's touch was a steadying anchor in the rising sea of his panic. She leaned in, her breath hot against his ear, whispering a code that cut through the chaos. Just like that, the world narrowed. 3 o'clock, she breathed, her voice a razor-thin wire of focus. Low sweep. 2 more at 10 and 2. Wait for my mark. What followed was a heartbeat of pure, agonizing tension. Kaelen could smell the wood smoke on the scouts, the salt of their sweat, and the predatory intensity of their gaze. He waited, his muscles coiled like a spring that had been compressed for 10 years. In the span of a breath, Elara squeezed his shoulder. Now! Her body moved on instinct, and his followed. Kaelen lunged toward the 3 o'clock position, his rusted blade screaming through the air. He didn't see the man's throat. He felt the vibration of the scout's surprised gasp. And just like that, everything changed. The first man went down with a wet, gurgling sound. Kaelen didn't stop. He pivoted on his heel, guided by the slight tug of Elara's hand on his tunic, leading him through the dance of death. To make things worse, the other 2 scouts panicked. They swung wildly, their blades whistling past Kaelen's ears. He didn't fear them. For the first time since the blinding, he wasn't a victim. He was a storm. Chapter 5. The Weight of Survival. Silence returned to the cabin, but it wasn't the peaceful silence Kaelen had cultivated. It was a heavy, iron-scented silence that tasted of copper and regret. He stood over the bodies, his chest heaving, the rusted blade dripping onto the floorboards. As the silence roared, he felt the adrenaline begin to drain, replaced by a crushing, dark night of the soul sensation. He had killed again. He had used the skills the king gave him to protect a life he didn't even know. Next, he felt the shame of his survival. It was the same feeling he had when he walked away from his battalion's execution. He felt like a monster that refused to die, a weapon that only knew how to break things. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't hide her own trembling as she stepped over a fallen scout to reach him. She reached out to take the sword from his hand, but he pulled away. He turned his ruined face toward her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Truth be told, he wanted to scream at her to leave. He wanted to go back to being a ghost. "Get out," he rasped, his voice breaking. "I told you. I'm a weapon. If you stay, you'll just be another body I have to carry." Still, she didn't back down. She stepped closer, stepping into his personal space until her chest almost brushed his arm. "You saved me, Kaelen. And those men, they weren't here for tea. They were the king's butchers." Instead of leaving, she grabbed his hand. She forced him to feel the royal crest on the dead man's cloak. "The king hasn't forgotten you," she whispered. "And he hasn't stopped hurting people like me. Look at what you can do. You're not broken. You're just unlit." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, or so it felt to his heightened touch, he realized she wasn't afraid of him. She was looking at him with hungry focus, seeing a savior where he only saw a wreck. In that moment, he felt a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. He didn't want to feel, but her hope was like a needle piercing his skin. He was terrified that her presence would make him feel the world again, the pain, the cold, and the flickering light of hope. Yet, he knew she was right. The scouts were just the beginning. The Alpha King was a hound who wouldn't stop until he had Kaelen's head on a pike. Chapter 6. Into the Cold Wind. The decision was made not in words, but in the way Kaelen reached for his old tattered traveling cloak. He draped it over his shoulders, hiding the scars that marked him as a traitor. Before she could move, Elara was already packing a small bag with what little food he had left. She worked with a cynical, hyper-observant efficiency that told him she had been running her whole life. Moments later, She stood by the shattered door. "The king has sealed the borders, Kaelen," she said, her voice dropping to a somber tone. "He's using the ember vines to create a wall of thorns that no one can pass. He's turning this kingdom into a cage." Because of that, Kaelen felt a new kind of rage. It wasn't the hot, blinding anger of the fight, but a cold, steady simmer. Valerius wasn't just killing soldiers anymore, he was suffocating the world. As the wind shifted, bringing the scent of more horses from the valley, Kaelen stepped across the threshold of his cabin. He felt the mountain air hit his face, sharp and biting. He was leaving his grave behind. What followed was a forced march into the darkness of the mountain pass. He walked with his hand on Elara's shoulder, a lethal pact written in their silence. He was no longer a hermit. He was a fugitive. In fact, his new goal was simple. He didn't want to live, but he didn't want to die uselessly anymore. If he was going to fall, he would fall like a mountain, crushing everything beneath him. Soon after, they reached the edge of the Widow's Peak and looked, or rather, Elara looked, down at the valley. "The iron veins," she whispered. "The old mining tunnels. They run all the way to the capital. It's our only way in." As if fate whispered, Kaelen felt the deep, low thrum of the earth beneath his feet. The tunnels were calling to him. In the dark, in the deep places where no one could see, he would be king. Between one breath and the next, he tightened his grip on the rusted sword. "Lead the way, Elara," he said, his voice echoing with the authority of the Iron Gale. "Let's see if the king remembers how to bleed." And just like that, everything changed. The hunt had begun, but the Alpha King didn't realize that he wasn't the only predator in the woods. Come morning, the cabin would be empty and the world would have a reason to be afraid of the dark again. Chapter 7. The Rhythm of the Dark. The descent into the iron veins felt like being swallowed by a cold stone beast. Kaelen could hear the moisture dripping from the jagged stalactites, each plink echoing like a hammer on an anvil. Without warning, the air changed, becoming thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient copper. He felt the walls closing in, a narrow tunnel that would have petrified a lesser man. In fact, Kaelen felt a strange sense of peace. In the absolute black of the mines, everyone was as blind as he was. He could hear Elara's breathing ahead of him, a quick, shallow sound that told him she was determined but scared. Moments later, he stumbled over a protruding root. He growled, a low, frustrated sound that rumbled in his throat like distant thunder. He hated the stunted feeling of not knowing where to place his feet. Because of that, Elara stopped. He felt her move toward him, her scent of rain and parchment wrapping around him in the narrow space. "We need a better way," she whispered. "I can't keep catching you, and you can't keep guessing." What followed was the sound of leather rubbing against leather. She took a long, thin strap from her pack and looped it around his wrist, then tied the other end to her own. As if pulled by a string, Kaelen felt the slight tug of the tether. It was a lethal pact, made physical. He felt a surge of solitary survivalist pride flare up, wanting to rip the leash away. Still, he didn't move. He felt the weight of her trust through the leather cord. "This is the symbiotic combat system," she said, her voice echoing softly. "One tug for left, two for right. A sharp pull means danger. You listen to the cord, Kaelen. You let me be your eyes." In that moment, he realized he was no longer a lone wolf. He was half of a whole. He felt the bond pulse through the strap, a rhythmic vibration that synchronized their heartbeats in the dark. Eventually, they began to move again. The tether became a language. He learned to feel the subtle tension in her wrist, predicting her steps before she even took them. Chapter 8. The language of the tether days blurred into a single subterranean crawl. Kaelen sat on a cold stone ledge while Elara practiced throwing small pebbles at him from the shadows. Without thinking, he swiped at the air. The stone clattered against the wall inches from his head. He cursed under his breath, his internal flaw of impatience boiling over. Rather than offering pity, Elara laughed. You're listening to the air, Kaelen. Don't listen to the air. Listen to the floor. Feel the ripple when I move. As the silence stretched, he closed his eyes and pressed his palms flat against the cave floor. He focused on the seismic echolocation he had begun to master in the cabin. Soon after, he felt it. A tiny rhythmic vibration, the shift of her weight on a loose stone. It was a sizzling sensation that traveled up his arms and into his spine. Just like that, the world turned into a map of ripples. He could see the curve of the tunnel and the height of the ceiling through the way the sound of their breathing bounced off the rocks. Truth be told, it was more intoxicating than sight ever was. He felt more intimate and dangerous than he had as a sighted general. He wasn't just looking at the world. He was a part of its heartbeat. Before the words left her lips, she threw another stone. Kaelen didn't move his head. He caught it in midair, his fingers closing around the cold pebble with predatory intensity. In the echo of his voice, he whispered, "Again." He felt a sizzling spark of connection between them. She wasn't just his guide anymore, she was his partner in a dance of shadows. But then, the fun ended. A low mechanical hum began to vibrate through the walls. It was the sound of the king's machines, deep in the heart of the veins. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, or so he imagined from the sudden heat of her grip on the tether, Elara pulled him close. "A supply depot," she breathed. "The Sun Guard uses this route to move ember vines to the border," which meant it was time for their first shadow heist. Kaelen felt his wolf stir, a growl rising in his throat. He wasn't a broken tool anymore. He was a weapon that had finally been sharpened. Chapter 9. The First Strike. The supply depot was a hive of activity, smelling of ozone and the bitter metallic scent of the ember vines. Kaelen stood in the mouth of the tunnel, the tether between him and Elara tight and humming. Moments later, he felt the signal. 2 sharp tugs. Engage. Her body moved on instinct, and he followed. They moved through the depot like a 2-headed ghost. Elara guided him behind crates and under catwalks, her whispers directing his blade with tactical precision. In fact, the Sun Guards didn't even know they were being hunted. Kaelen would emerge from the darkness, strike with a single lethal blow, and vanish before the body hit the floor. What followed was a frantic, high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. Elara used her hyper-spatial awareness to predict the guards' patrol routes, while Kaelen provided the muscle to silence them. To make things worse, a guard spotted them. He opened his mouth to shout, but Kaelen was already there. He didn't need light to find a heart. He felt the heat of the man's chest and drove the rusted iron home. As the tension broke, they reached the main vault. Elara began stuffing her pack with supplies, food, medicine, and refined vine oil. Kaelen stood guard, his ears tracking the frantic heartbeats of the remaining soldiers. Despite that, they weren't just here for food. They were here to prove a point. Kaelen used his seismic sense to find the main support beam of the depot. With a single glance, or the blind equivalent of one, he felt the weakness in the stone. He struck the beam with the pommel of his sword, a precise, heavy blow that sent a crack running up to the ceiling. Between one breath and the next, the depot began to groan. "Run!" Elara hissed, her hand pulling hard on the tether. As the sky darkened, or at least the darkness deepened as the dust rose, they sprinted back into the safety of the iron veins. Behind them, the depot collapsed in a roar of stone and metal. And just like that, everything changed. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They were a whisper of hope in the dark. That night, as they shared a meager meal in a hidden alcove, Kaelen felt the sizzling heat of Elara's stare. "We did it," she whispered. In the quiet that followed, Kaelen realized the core emotional question was shifting. He wasn't just a weapon. He was a man who was learning to see through someone else's heart. Chapter 10. The Echoes of the Dead. The news of the depot's destruction spread through the dredge like a wildfire in a gale. Kaelen could feel the change in the atmosphere of the lower tunnels. The air no longer tasted of stagnant despair, but of sizzling anticipation. Truth be told, he wasn't used to being a symbol. He sat in the darkness of a secondary vein, his fingers tracing the leather tether that now felt less like a leash and more like a part of his own skin. He could hear Elara talking to a group of desperate miners a few yards away, her voice breezy and confident, as she traded stolen medicine for information. Soon after, she returned to his side, her footsteps light and hurried. "The king is furious, Kaelen," she whispered, her breath smelling of the bitter tea the miners brewed. "He's doubled the bounty on the ghost of the veins. Not only that, he started moving the punching bags to the primary refinery at Sector 7. Because of that, Kaelen felt a cold spike of dread. He knew Sector 7. It was a fortress built into a natural cavern, surrounded by a wall of thorns so thick the vibrations of the earth were dampened. What followed was a tactical debate that lasted until the damp walls began to sweat. Elara wanted to hit the refinery while the king was distracted, but Kaelen's military-coded mind sensed a trap. He felt the pressure building in his chest, a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. Still, he couldn't ignore the pull of the mission. He needed to know what Valerius was doing with the prisoners. He stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. "We go tonight," he growled, his voice a low, rumbling snarl of command. "But we go in through the drainage pipes. They won't expect us to crawl through the filth." Moments later, they were moving. The tether between them was taut, a physical manifestation of their shared resolve. Kaelen felt the seismic echolocation guiding him, but the deeper they went, the more the ground seemed to scream with the hum of the king's machinery. Chapter 11. The Battery of Souls. Infiltrating Sector 7 was like walking into a nightmare. The smell hit Kaelen first, not just the ozone of the ember vines, but the sweet, sickly scent of rotting hope. Without warning, Elara's hand on the tether jerked violently. He stopped instantly, his hand moving to the hilt of his rusted blade. He could feel her heart racing through the leather strap, a frantic drumming that told him she had seen something horrific. In fact, the midpoint shift was about to break him. "Kaelen," she choked out, her voice trembling. "They aren't just prisoners. They're connected. The vines are growing into them." As if fate demanded it, Kaelen pushed past her, his boots splashing in the shallow, oily water. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic, a cage. But inside the cage, he felt the rough, scarred skin of a human face. Before the words left her lips, he recognized the shape of the jaw. He felt the jagged scar that ran from the man's ear to his chin. It was Iris, his sergeant. The man he thought he had executed 10 years ago to satisfy the king's bloodlust. What followed was a revelation that turned Kaelen's world to ash. The king hadn't just blinded him. He had turned his brothers-in-arms into living batteries for his empire. The ember vines were feeding on their very life force, turning their pain into power. Deep down, she knew the truth, but Kaelen was only just realizing the depth of the Alpha King's narcissistic sociopathy. He fell to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold bars of the cage. The shame he had carried for a decade was a lie. His men weren't dead. They were in a hell he had helped build. As the silence roared, Kaelen felt a sizzling rage replace his apathy. It wasn't about escape anymore. It wasn't even about survival. To make things worse, the man in the cage let out a low, agonizing moan. Kaelen could feel the vibrations of the ember vines pulsing through the sergeant's body, a rhythmic torture that never ended. Chapter 12. The Spark of Rebellion. Kaelen didn't just stand up. He rose like a titan emerging from the earth. The solitary survivalist was gone, burned away by a fury so pure it felt like fire beneath his skin. Next, he gripped the bars of the cage. With a growl that rose in his throat, he wrenched the metal aside, his scarred muscles bulging with a strength born of desperation. He didn't care if the guards heard him. He didn't care if the whole mountain collapsed. But then Elara grabbed his arm. "Kaelen, stop! You'll alert the truthsayers." Her voice was a hesitant whisper, but it carried the weight of reality. Rather than listening, he turned to her, his ruined eyes fixed on where he knew her face to be. "They are my men, Elara," he rasped, his voice thick with simmering rage. "Valerius didn't just take my sight, he took their souls." Because of that, the stakes were now higher and more personal than ever before. He realized that the king's power wasn't just physical, it was fueled by the agony of the innocent. Soon after, a siren began to wail. The vibrations tore through Kaelen's seismic sense like a serrated blade. The Sun Guard was coming. The heist had turned into a high-stakes conflict for the very heart of the rebellion. As the sky darkened, or rather as the refinery lights flickered and dimmed, Kaelen turned back to the cages. "Free them," he commanded, his voice echoing with the authority of the Iron Gale. Every single one of them. What followed was a frantic scramble. Elara used her hyper-spatial awareness to find the release valves, while Kaelen stood at the mouth of the chamber, his rusted blade ready to meet the first wave of guards. At that moment, he wasn't a broken weapon. He was the shield for the people the world had forgotten. And just like that, everything changed. The broken general had found a reason to live, and the Alpha King was about to find a reason to fear the man he thought he had destroyed. By the time the first Sun Guard reached the chamber, Kaelen was waiting, his seismic sense locked onto their heartbeats. The shadow heist was over. The revolution had begun. Chapter 13. The General's Return. The Iron Veins were no longer a hiding place. They had become a war room. Kaelen sat on a jagged outcrop, his blindfold discarded, feeling the weight of the attention from the 50 men and women they had dragged from the refinery. Truth be told, he could smell the ozone of the ember vines still clinging to their skin, a sickly sweet reminder of their torture. He felt the seismic hum of their shallow breathing, ragged, terrified, yet waiting for him to speak. He wasn't just Kaelen the Hermit anymore. He was the Iron Gale, standing in the center of a brewing storm. Next, he felt Elara move to his side. She didn't say a word, but the way her shoulder brushed his arm was a sizzling declaration of support. She had become his bridge to these people, the voice that translated his grim silence into hope. Because of that, he reached up and touched the leather tether still tied to his wrist. It was no longer a leash, it was a nerve ending. "You were the king's fuel," Kaelen growled, his voice a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to shake the very walls of the cavern. "Tonight, you become his fire." What followed was a surge of raw, primal emotion from the crowd. He felt the floor vibrate with their stomping feet, a rhythmic, subterranean heartbeat of defiance. He realized he was committing to a path from which there was no retreat. Moments later, Elara leaned in, her scent of rain and parchment grounding him. "They're ready to die for you, Kaelen," she whispered. "But are you ready to let them?" The question hit him harder than any blade. He was terrified that his leadership would lead to another massacre. Chapter 14. The Scent of Betrayal. Training the punching bags was a grueling, agonizing process that tested every ounce of Kaelen's patience. He moved among them, his hands hyper-observant, as he corrected their grips on scavenged spears. As the silence stretched, a new vibration entered the tunnels, a sharp, frantic tapping of boots. It wasn't one of his soldiers. He felt the tension break as the tether on his wrist jerked 3 times. Danger. Close. In fact, the king's truthsayers had found them. Kaelen felt the air thicken with the bitter metallic scent of the king's elite interrogators. They didn't come with swords. They came with the power to sense lies and break minds. Before she could move, Kaelen had navigated the crowd and intercepted a panicked scout who was trying to bolt for the upper tunnels. He caught the man by the throat, feeling the frantic drumming of a traitor's pulse. Without thinking, he slammed the man against the cave wall. "Who did you tell?" Kaelen's voice was a predatory snarl. He could feel the scout's terror, a cold sweat that smelled of copper. Rather than answering, the scout whimpered, "They have my sister, General, the truthsayer. He saw my heart." What followed was a brutal realization. Their secrecy was shattered. The king knew they were building an army in the dark. Kaelen felt his past trauma resurface like a drowning man gasping for air. He was leading these people into a slaughterhouse, just like his old battalion. On the other hand, Elara stepped forward, her hand finding his. "We don't hide anymore, Kaelen. If they know we're here, we make them regret the knowledge." Her sizzling resolve cut through his fear. Chapter 15. The Threshold of Blood. The decision to move the army toward the capital was the point of no return. Kaelen stood at the mouth of the Great Vein, the tunnel that led directly beneath the Alpha King's palace. As if fate whispered, he felt the bond between him and Elara pull tighter. They weren't just partners in a heist, they were interdependent as power itself. He reached out, his hand finding the side of her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a sizzling, emotional intensity. In that moment, he let her see his vulnerability. "If we do this, Elara, if I lose you in the dark..." His voice trailed off, thick with unspoken desire, and a fear he couldn't name. Instead of answering with words, she leaned her forehead against his. "You won't lose me. I'm your eyes, remember? I'm not looking away." But then, the ground groaned. A massive explosion rocked the upper levels of the veins. The Alpha King wasn't waiting for them to arrive. He was bringing the ceiling down on their heads. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara pulled on the tether. "They're here! The Sun Guard is breaching the Sector 9 gate!" Without another word, Kaelen drew his rusted blade. It didn't feel like a broken tool anymore. It felt like an extension of his rage. He could hear the Sun Guard's aerial cavalry screaming through the shafts above, their wings beating like the drums of war. Because of that, the sizzling physical romance of their connection turned into a tactical fire. They moved as one, a blur of gray hair and hyper-observant motion. Kaelen didn't need to see the enemy. He felt the seismic ripples of their approach. And just like that, everything changed. The time for shadows was over. The broken general was stepping into the light of his own burning world, and he wouldn't stop until the Alpha King felt the cold edge of a weapon that refused to stay broken. By the time the smoke cleared from the first blast, Kaelen and Elara were already deep into the palace's foundations. The final confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. Chapter 16. The Screaming Void. The trap didn't spring with a roar, it sprang with a blinding, artificial sun. Kaelen and Elara breached the primary refinery, expecting a tactical foothold, but without warning, the entire cavern ignited with a high-pitched harmonic whine. Truth be told, Kaelen had never known true terror until his seismic sense was weaponized against him. The Alpha King had installed sonic emitters along the walls, and as they flared to life, the vibrations tore through Kaelen's mind like 1,000 serrated needles. He clutched his head, his seismic echolocation shattering into a chaotic, screaming void of noise. In fact, he was paralyzed. He felt the world tilt and dissolve. He couldn't see the floor. He couldn't hear the enemy. He was back in the palace basement, the heat of the branding iron returning to his sockets in a phantom surge of agony. Moments later, a voice boomed over the speakers, a voice that sounded like indulgent condescension turned into a physical weight. "Did you really think I didn't know you were in my cellar, Kaelen?" Valerius laughed, the sound bouncing off the metal vats. "I let you gather the filth. It's easier to burn a pile than a single stray." Because of that, Kaelen felt the first wave of true despair. He had led the punching bags directly into a slaughterhouse. He reached out blindly, his hand clawing at the air for the one thing that kept him sane. What followed was the most sickening sensation of his life. He felt the leather tether on his wrist go slack. He jerked it, desperate for a response, but there was only a terrifying weightlessness. Chapter 17. The Severed Sight. "Kaelen!" Elara's scream cut through the sonic feedback, but it was moving away. It was being dragged. As the silence roared, or rather as the mechanical screaming drowned out the world, Kaelen felt the vibration of heavy boots on the catwalk above. He tried to lunge toward her voice, but without her guidance, he crashed into a steaming pipe. The metal burned his arm, but he didn't feel the heat. He only felt the cold weight of her absence. To make things worse, the ceiling began to groan. Valerius wasn't just capturing them. He was collapsing the refinery to bury the evidence of his batteries. Kaelen felt the earth shudder as the primary supports were detonated. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't break free from the Sun Guard's iron grip. Kaelen heard the frantic drumming of her heels against armor, and then the sound of a heavy blow. Her voice went silent. Between one breath and the next, the world came down on top of him. A massive section of the cavern roof gave way. Kaelen moved on instinct, diving toward a gap between the vats, but a secondary collapse pinned his legs under a mountain of shale and twisted iron. Still, he tried to claw his way out. His fingers bled as he tore at the rubble. "Elara!" he rasped, but his voice was swallowed by the settling dust. He was alone. He was pinned. And for the first time in months, he was truly, hopelessly blind. As if fate whispered, he realized the truthsayers had won. They didn't need to read his heart. They had broken it. He lay in the darkness, the smell of ozone and his own blood filling his lungs. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. Kaelen lay trapped under the weight of the king's palace, the silence returning to mock him. He could feel the slow, rhythmic thump-thump of his own heart, and it disgusted him. Next, he felt the shame return with the force of a tidal wave. He had believed he was a man again, but he was just a broken weapon that had hurt the only person who dared to look at him with love. He had failed his battalion, and now he had failed the eyes that gave him a second chance. Because of that, he stopped digging. He let his head fall back against the cold stone. Why fight? Every time he struck, someone he loved bled. The Alpha King was right. Kaelen was a curse. In the quiet that followed, he felt the all-is-lost moment settle into his marrow. He imagined Elara in a cell, being drained by the ember vines, her rain and parchment scent replaced by the metallic tang of the king's greed. The thought was a jagged blade in his chest. Yet, as the dust settled, a tiny vibration reached him. It wasn't a sonic emitter. It wasn't a bomb. It was a rhythmic, steady tapping on the pipes. Clang, clang, clang. As the echo faded, he realized it was the punching bags. They weren't dead. They were in the pipes, using the language he had taught them to find their commander. At that moment, Kaelen's internal flaw was challenged. He thought he was the one protecting them, but they were the ones reaching through the dark for him. He wasn't a lone weapon. He was a part of a living machine that refused to be shut down. And just like that, everything changed. He felt a sizzling spark of defiance reignite in his gut. He didn't have her eyes, but he had her voice in his head. "You're not broken. You're just unlit." By the time the air began to thin in his stone pocket, Kaelen Thorne stopped acting like a victim and started acting like a general. He braced his back against the rubble, his scarred muscles screaming as he prepared to shove the world off of him. What followed was the beginning of the end for the Alpha King. Chapter 19. The Heartbeat of the Mountain. Kaelen didn't just move the stone, he willed the earth to move with him. With a growl that rose in his throat, he braced his shoulders against the slab of shale pinning him down, his scarred muscles bulging until the skin felt like it would burst. Truth be told, the pain was a mercy. It gave him a center, a sharp, burning point in a world that had become a screaming void. He felt the weight shift, the groan of metal protesting, and then the air rushed into his lungs. He was free, but he was stumbling, his hands scraping against the jagged edges of the ruins. Next, he felt the rhythmic tapping on the pipes again. Clang, clang, clang. It was a sizzling beacon of sound. He reached out, his fingers finding the cold iron of a drainage pipe, and he realized he wasn't alone. Because of that, he didn't need Elara's tether to find his way. He put his ear to the metal and heard the frantic, desperate whispers of Eris and the others. They were calling for the Iron Gale. What followed was a surge of renewed hope that tasted like ozone and fire. He crawled through the narrow spaces of the collapse, his seismic echolocation slowly stitching itself back together. He could feel the palace above him, a massive, bloated heart of stone, and he could feel the Embervine nexus pulsing at its base. Moments later, he reached a pocket of air where Eris was waiting. He felt the man's rough hand grab his shoulder, pulling him into a crouch. "General," the sergeant rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought we lost you, the girl. They took her to the high spire." As fire bloomed beneath his skin, Kaelen gripped Eris's arm. He didn't ask if they were scared. He didn't ask if they had weapons. "Tell the men to find the primary conduits," Kaelen commanded, his voice a low, rumbling vibration of authority. "We aren't just escaping. We are going up." Chapter 20. Mapping the Void. In the darkness of the palace foundations, Kaelen sat for a moment, his eyes closed, his mind mapping the void. He remembered everything Elara had told him during their nights in the Iron Veins. In fact, she had been his cartographer. He recalled her describing the palace as a beast of gold and bone, with 3 main elevators and a central staircase that acted like a spine. He could see it now, not with light, but with the hyperspatial awareness she had gifted him. Soon after, he gathered the remaining punching bags. They were a ragged army, smelling of rain and desperation, armed only with the scraps of the refinery. Rather than fear, they radiated a predatory intensity. They had been the king's batteries, and now they were a short circuit waiting to happen. Kaelen felt the bond pulse between them, a collective rage that felt like a living thing. As the silence stretched, he reached into his pocket and found a scrap of the leather tether that had been severed. He tied it around his wrist. "I am your eyes tonight," he told them, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "And you are my hands. We move as one." Which meant the time for tactical heists was over. This was a race to the climax, a frontal assault on the ego of a god. He could feel the sizzling heat of the palace's power above him, the ember vines humming with stolen life. Before the words left his lips, he felt a shift in the air. The palace guards were coming down. He could hear the clatter of boots and the high-pitched whistle of the truthsayers' flutes. In the echo of his voice, he gave the only order that mattered. Break them. Chapter 21. The Ascent of the Fallen. The breach was a high-stakes conflict of raw power against refined cruelty. Kaelen led the charge, his seismic echolocation detecting the heartbeats of the Sun Guard before they even turned the corner. Without thinking, he moved with a terrifying, calm grace. He didn't need sight to find a throat. He felt the vibrations of their shouts and the scent of iron on their armor. He was a ghost of fur and fury, a wolf that had found its pack in the dark. As her wolf stirred, or rather, as his own primal instincts surged, Kaelen felt the palace begin to tremble. The rebels were hitting the conduits, severing the king's power piece by piece. The artificial suns in the hallways flickered and died. To make things worse for the king, the darkness was Kaelen's kingdom. He moved through the shadows like a blade through silk, his rusted iron sword finding the gaps in the Sun Guard's plate. By the time they reached the base of the high spire, the floor was slick with the bitter metallic scent of victory. Kaelen stopped at the foot of the great spiral stairs. He could feel the vibrations of Elara's breathing from far above. It was faint. It was shattered and desperate. As the wind shifted through the elevator shafts, he felt the presence of Valerius waiting at the top. The Alpha King was alone now, stripped of his batteries and his light. At that moment, Kaelen Thorne didn't feel like a broken weapon. He felt like the inevitable hand of justice. He turned to Eris and the others. "Hold the door. I'm going for my eyes." And just like that, everything changed. He began to climb, each step a sizzling declaration of reclamation. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a man who was finally, truly whole. What followed was the final confrontation. Chapter 22. The Climax. The air in the high spire didn't just smell of the palace's luxury. It was thick with the sizzling scent of ozone and Elara's blood. Kaelen burst through the doors, his boots skidding on marble that felt as slick as ice. Truth be told, he didn't need sight to find the Alpha King. Valerius radiated a narcissistic sociopathy that hummed through the floorboards like a diseased heart. Kaelen could hear the king's shallow, panicked breathing and the metallic scrape of a ceremonial blade being drawn. Next, he felt the presence of Elara. She was chained to the central embervine conduit, her pulse a frantic, dying drumbeat that pulled at his very soul. He felt the space between them burn with a desperate need to reach her. Because of that, he didn't wait for a challenge. Kaelen lunged, his rusted iron blade a blur in the dim light of the dying vines. Valerius screamed, a sound of shock and fury, and the two men collided in a spray of sparks and steel. What followed was a breathtaking display of symbiotic combat without the tether. Even across the room, Elara found her voice, a shattered but steady anchor in the dark. "Son!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with effort. At that moment, Kaelen understood. He didn't strike at the king. He struck at the massive light crystal suspended above the throne. The crystal shattered, and the palace was plunged into a crushing, absolute darkness. As the silence roared, the advantage shifted. In the dark, Valerius was a child, flailing at shadows he couldn't see. Kaelen, however, was a god of vibrations. He felt the king's footstep, the whoosh of his blade, and the exact location of his thumping, terrified heart. Before either could speak, Kaelen drove his blade home. He felt the cold weight of the iron pass through the king's chest, severing the connection to the stolen power of the realm. The ember vines let out a final, high-pitched whine, and went cold. Chapter 23. Falling Action. Part 1. The silence that followed the king's death was heavy and visceral, broken only by the sound of Kaelen's ragged gasps. He didn't celebrate. He didn't roar in triumph. Moments later, he was at Elara's side. He tore at the vines that bound her, his fingers bleeding and frantic as he felt for the locks on her chains. He felt her slump into his arms, her rain and parchment scent the only thing that made the world real again. In fact, he didn't ask about the kingdom or the crown. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice thick with a mix of relief and grief. He pressed his forehead against hers, the sizzling physical romance of their bond finally finding its peace. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't stop the tears. She reached up, her fingers tracing the scars on his face with a warm and wondering touch. "We're alive, Kaelen," she whispered. "We're actually alive." What followed was the sound of Eris and the others breaching the spire. Kaelen felt the seismic ripples of his men, his brothers, filling the room. They didn't come to arrest him. They came to kneel. Still, Kaelen didn't look at them. He only had eyes for the woman in his arms. He realized the core emotional question had been answered. He wasn't a weapon anymore. He was a man who had been found. As the truth unraveled, he felt the weight of the Alpha title being offered to him by the silence of the room. He felt the pressure of leadership and the beckoning of a new throne. Chapter 24. Falling Action. Part 2. Resolution. The new normal didn't involve gold or crowns. It involved the smell of pine needles and the gentle rhythmic pauses of a world that was no longer screaming. Eventually, the council took over the city, and the dredge began to rise into the light. Kaelen watched or felt the transition from a distance. He had no desire to rule the ruins he had helped create. Come morning, he stood on the balcony of the palace one last time. He felt the sunlight burn against his face, a warmth that felt like a precious gift. He was a man who had reclaimed his soul through the fire. Rather than staying, he turned back toward the mountains. He felt Elara's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. They were leaving the palace behind, moving back toward the Widow's Peak. But this time, they weren't going to a grave. Truth be told, the kingdom was still broken. and the scars would take years to heal. But as Kaelen Thorne walked away from the throne, he felt a sizzling sense of freedom. He was no longer the Iron Gale, he was just Kaelen. And just like that, everything changed. He wasn't defined by what he had lost, but by what he had found in the dark. He felt the bond pulse, one last time, a steady, quiet rhythm that promised a future. In the stillness that followed, he realized that being a weapon was easy, but being a man was a high-wire act of trust that he was finally ready to perform. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the forest, Kaelen Thorne finally let go of the rusted blade. Epilogue, seen 1 year later. The Widow's Peak was no longer a place of cold ash. Kaelen stood on the porch, the vibrations of the mountain now a familiar, friendly song. Maybe it was fate, but he heard the sound of Elara's footsteps, strong, confident, and full of life. She walked up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, her head resting against his back. Without another word, she began to describe the sunrise. She talked of crimson and gold, of the way the light hit the valley floor and turned the river into a ribbon of silver. As her voice lingered in the air, Kaelen didn't just listen. He felt the colors. He felt the warmth of the sun and the warmth of her love. He finally saw a future that wasn't written in blood, and she let it happen.